to do a brief overview of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system differs from the somatic nervous system in many ways. The chart in our notes explains it very well. This is just a bigger version. So the effector for the SNS would be the skeletal muscles. Whereas in the ANS, it's the cardiac muscles and smooth muscle and glands. Number of motor neurons and efferent pathway, efferent being exiting the CNS, would be single. There's just the one. And the ANS has actually two sets. The first would be where the cell body resides in the central nervous system and the axon extends to the autonomic ganglion. And then from there, the second fiber would come from the ganglion to the effector. The myelination of the axons and the autonomic nervous system is myelinated always, and myelinated is faster. The autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic, which means before the ganglion, is lightly myelinated, and the postganglionic, so after the ganglion, is not myelinated ever. The neurotransmitters for the SNS is acetylcholine, and for the ANS, it's acetylcholine and norepinephrine. The response of the effector to neurotransmitter is in the SNS, it's excitation all the time. So that it's always exciting. And this is a big difference between the SNS and the ANS, is that the ANS has the ability to excite or inhibit its response to the effector from the neurotransmitter. This is just another kind of a chart to show. So the somatic nervous system would be the neuron is in the cell body is in the CNS itself, and it stretches all the way to the effector organ, which would be a muscle, like this would be the bicep, and it's heavily myelinated, and it uses ACH at the very end for its neurotransmitter. In the sympathetic, we have the cell body lying in the central nervous system. It goes a little lightly myelinated, then there's a ganglion and a neurotransmitter of acetylcholine, and then a postganglionic fiber going to the receptor, and that would be visceral organs, and non-myelinated here you see, and lightly myelinated here. The parasympathetic, same thing, cell body lies over in the central nervous system and goes to a ganglion. Acetylcholine is released, neurotransmitter, and then postganglionic fiber is not myelinated, and then ACH here, and then sympathetic is most always norepinephrine, and the parasympathetic is most always acetylcholine. And they are visceral organs, and these are skeletal muscles. Here we just have some more differences. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions. We have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The parasympathetic meaning rest and digest, and there's reasons for that. So when you're resting and digesting, the parasympathetic nervous system, also cranial sacral outflow for the nerves. So all the nerves for the parasympathetic start in the cranial region or the sacral region. And they do things such as stimulate saliva, constrict bronchi, expand bladder, and then the sympathetic region is called the fight or flight for the main reason because it does almost the exact opposite. So when you're not when you're stressed or when you're in a dangerous situation, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. It constricts the pupils. It stops the salivation. Your heart rate increases. It dilates your bronchi, so you get more oxygen to your skeletal muscles. It also hits the stimulates the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline, constricts the bladder. Then another difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic is where their ganglions lie. So in the parasympathetic region, the ganglion lays close to the effector. So you see here I have the ganglion, and the preganglionic nerve fiber is much longer than the postganglionic nerve fiber. You can see here, so it starts here and then ganglion, and these are much shorter. This makes the nerve impulses a lot shorter and more localized. Now in the sympathetic region, the ganglion lays almost right next to the spinal cord. They are thoracolumnar, so the nerves lie mostly in the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord. They're all within this region. And like I said, they do almost complete opposite things. We have now the reflex art, for the visceral is it has the same 5 components as the somatic reflex arch. The reflex arch sends information about chemical changes, stretch, temperature, and irritation of the visceral. So it starts here, so we have the number 1, the visceral receptor, and goes up here. This is the visceral sensory neuron, so coming out. And then right here is the integration center. And then number 4 is the motor neuron. But you see the motor neuron coming down here. And then once it's the ganglion, it switches, and there's another little center here where it changes from the preganglionic, which is the red, to the postganglionic fiber. And then number 5 would be the visceral effector, be the receptor there. Then we have our neurotransmitters. Again, this is just a chart from our notes, but it lays out everything so nice. So the neurotransmitters, we have the receptor, the location, and the response. So adrenergic, which is norepinephrine, is the A1, A2, B1, B2. So the A1, location be the sympathetic organs, except the heart, blood vessels of the skin, the mucosa, and the viscera, and the kidneys. Its response is excitation, so vasoconstriction and constriction and pupil dilation. The A2 would be blood platelets for the location, and it mediates inhibition of the norepinephrine release, and it promotes blood clotting. Beta 1, primarily heart and blood vessels, also the kidney, livers, and adipocytes. And response is stimulation. It increases heart rate, dilates the arteries. B2, lungs, blood vessels in the heart, and most other sympathetic target organs. It's usually inhibition, and it stimulates insulin secretion. The cholinergic is acetylcholine for the neurotransmitter, and they include nicotine and muscarinic. Nicotinic is location is all ganglionic neurons. neurons in the neuromuscular junction in the SNS. And its response is excitation. Muscarinic is parasympathetic target organs. Some sympathetic organs, such as the eccrine sweat glands, blood vessels, and the blood vessels in the skeletal muscles. And it's usually excitation. Now, some of the drugs that you can take that affect the autonomic nervous system are they're called beta blockers, and what they do is they block the B1 receptors, and that is for hypertension. So it decreases blood pressure. So that's one of the drugs. Now, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of the ANS usually produce opposite effects. Although both are partially active, one usually dominates in different circumstances. Oddly enough, though, you need both of them to have sex. They work together. The parasympathetic division causes the erection in both the male and the female, and the sympathetic division causes ejaculation and vaginal spasms. Even though the ANS is not voluntary control, it is actively regulated by the CNS and the spinal cord, brainstem, and hypothalamus. The hypothalamus being the integration center. Through the ANS, it coordinates blood pressure, body temperature, water balance, and endocrine activity. Some of the homeostatic imbalances of the ANS are autonomic neuropathy. That's damage to the autonomic nerves. It's common in complications with diabetes mellitus. Another one is Raynaud's disease, and that's kind of when you start to get cold and your blood vessels clamp down. This is a relatively short chapter, and the notes cover it really well, and I hope I did an okay job of explaining it.